I was writing indie game scores throughout high school and college. I did my undergrad at Yale University, majoring in music. I was class of 2005. And I continued to write for indie games throughout the whole time, mostly based on like internet projects and like mods and whatnot. I joined Audio Gang, which is like the Game Audio Network Guild, which is an online community for game music. And that's where I learned a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about. It's also how I got a lot of the gigs that I've worked on for the past couple of years. After college, I moved back home to Philadelphia, where I'm originally from, and I started working on more indie and film titles. I co-founded Impact Soundworks, which is a sample development company. And then in 2008, I joined LucasArts as their music assistant. So I was doing a lot of music editing and music implementation. A lot of sort of like figuring out how do we get music from the films written by John Williams to work in real time in the games? How do we get it to interact? One day, as the story goes, while I was at LucasArts, I overheard that they needed more composers for Star Wars: The Old Republic. I probably wasn't supposed to hear that conversation, but I did anyway. And so I wrote a demo, and they said, hey, yeah, let's have you write some Old Republic music too. So that kind of started my composition career in games. And in addition to that, I also worked in music implementation while I was there. I did a lot of systems design for the Monkey Island Special Edition re-releases, as well as the Star Wars Force Unleashed series. And then later on, I started my freelance career with some of these titles. The first was Dead Island 2, and then Lara Croft, Temple of Osiris. Currently, I'm working on Anew the Distant Light, which is an upcoming indie game, which I'm really happy to share about, and so on. But yeah, in addition to writing the music for the games, I have a lengthy background in designing and implementing interactive game music systems. So this lecture will be an overview of some of the music systems I've designed for a few of the titles I've worked on for the last 20 years. So just some definitions to start us off. Interactive music system refers to all of the processes involved in playing back music in real time during the game. It can be as simple as just play a simple WAV file, as soon as the game starts, or it can be as complicated as using AI states and all kinds of triggers and even gameplay statistics to drive the music tempo, layering, and triggering. Content refers to pieces of music themselves. For instance, WAV files that have been prepared and edited for in-game use. And implementation refers to all of the real-time processes that are used to play the music back in-game, including not just the audio engine itself, but also all the playback logic that dictates how the content should be played. It can involve its own files, for instance. You might see a middleware engine like Wise, and it has its work units. You might see CSV files that are contained along with the audio, or even metadata within the WAV files themselves. These are generally called wrappers or cues, but every audio system kind of has a different terminology for it. But there's always some way, in addition to the content, that the implementation is programmed into the system. And as far as the personnel involved, there's the composer and their team, usually. They create the content. It's usually delivered in uncompressed WAV format. The implementer then will take those WAV files and plug them into the game's audio authoring tool. For example, you might have WWise, which is a very common middleware. And this is where you would set up the playback logic and interactivity, and also convert to the in-game file format. Usually there's some form of compression that's used. Level designers will hook the scripted music changes into the game and work with design tools, whereas engineers will hook in the more low-level triggers into the game logic directly. They're the people who can deal with AI states or game states and other parameters. These parameters, and this is kind of important for later, are called RTPCs, or real-time parameter controls, and they drive further musical interactivity and functionality. Engineers can also create what's called interfaces, which are kind of like bespoke UIs, or programs that we can use as intermediaries between the game and the audio engine. And as a music implementer, I've had to work with all of these different people and perform various combinations of the tasks myself. So the first score that I ever wrote was early in high school. It was this PC game, very indie, called Space Station Evolution. It's back in 1999. And the music worked as MIDI files played through DLS sound banks. Just out of curiosity, has anyone ever heard of DLS? DLS. Okay, how about sound fonts? Have you heard of sound fonts? Okay, imagine if sound fonts were like 70% more ghetto, like so crappy. You could do almost nothing, but it was fun. It was my first time getting out of that whole general MIDI paradigm of you have no idea how it's going to sound on different PCs. Here you could program your sounds. Previously, again, I'd worked with general MIDI, and so it was very liberating. I had a budget of 10 megabytes, which at the time was, this is the Cadillac of game music, you understand. That was huge. And the score had orchestral as well as rock band, synthesized, and folk music, and even some calypso elements. So I really need to find a way to optimize the samples so that it actually sounded good, even though there was only 10 megabytes for the entire score. So here's one example of that. Like try-hard 1999 orchestration. It's completely impossible for a real orchestra. Don't you dare write anything like that. But yeah, so this game used a very simple classic approach to music implementation. Every cue was a simple loop based on what level the player was currently in. So there really wasn't interactivity beyond you're currently in this level or in this room, so play this cue. The lead programmer built me a simple interface that let me specify a loop point somewhere within the middle of the MIDI file, which allowed me to write intro sections. But that's pretty much as far as it went with implementation. Fast forward, now it's 2008, and I'm at LucasArts, and some of my first projects there were the Star Wars Force Unleashed series. Force Unleashed 1 had its own proprietary audio engine called AI Muse. It was designed by ILM, by Industrial Light and Magic, the VFX company. And it used a flowchart style of visual scripting, similar to Unreal Blueprints, if you've ever used Unreal, to create audio cues, which are the wrappers that decided the implementation for the audio. And for music, we used a single CSV file, which is like an Excel text document, that listed all the music calls in the game in sequence as music events. And these events gave info on how the audio cues should trigger. For example, it would tell you, okay, well, here's the fade in and fade out times. There's optional playback start delay, and the playback volume as well. And our system was based entirely on Lua scripts as far as triggering these music events, with the hard-coded assumption that once a new music event was called in script, it would automatically stop the previously playing cue using the listed fade-out time and beginning the next. So what that means is, in practice, say a player enters a new area and triggers a battle. We can use a single music event to stop the previous music, seamlessly crossfade into a transitional piece, wait for a specified number of milliseconds for that transition to end, and then begin playing the main action loop. In other words, you actually have perfect synchronized transitions that have just kind of been pre-baked in. So this first video will show TIE Fighter Factory in Force Unleashed 1. I'll just show this and then explain.
Star Killer. I've intercepted a message from the flight tower. The Imperials have mobilized a TIE fighter squadron in your sector. Keep your eyes open.
And right on beat for now into the next meeting. So the entire game had these sort of very tightly scripted transitions from queue to queue for every level, with no AI states or anything like that. And we didn't actually have any beat matching or tempo sync. Like I mentioned, it was all kind of baked into the wave file. We knew exactly how long the transitions were, and we just simply said, wait this exact amount of time, and then it would start the next piece. And this worked really well, because the game was entirely linear, and the music was a combination of an original score written by Mark Grisky, as well as John Williams' film scores from the Star Wars movies. And they weren't recorded to a click anyway, so pretty much beat synchronization would have been almost impossible anyway. For Force Unleashed 2, we switched to the Wise audio engine, which is a very popular middleware that powers a lot of games nowadays, actually. But we largely kept the same scripted and linear music direction as before. However, this time, we did have a very basic AI state-based music switching with a simple combat on and off switch that I only used in certain parts of the game where combat wasn't continuous. Like maybe you would get ambushed, or you could defeat these enemies with stealth, and so on. I used the Wise music system to create beat-synchronized transitions from the action music to their corresponding ambient cues, and vice versa. Then every time the action or ambient cue would restart, they would use a randomized start point on the loop to avoid repetition. So here, I'll play you an example, and then I'll explain what we're listening to. So here's a cutscene. It's got its cutscene background music, separate layer. Transition into the action music. Transition to get into the ambient layer. So now we're at the ambient layer. So the way this worked was at the orchestral recording session, we would record an action cue. And then at the end of that, once we have everything we need, I would actually ask the string section alone to play a one-measure riff, just some passage from, let's say, measure 14 to measure 18. I would just have them play that section while diminuendoing. And then I'd use that as the transition. So we didn't actually need to write any new transitions. We just kind of used the original material and had them perform it differently in real time. And I would use that impromptu strings recording as the transition into like some sort of a low sustaining note that agreed with the key of the ambient cue that would come later. And then we would just seamlessly decrease the intensity on beat using Wise's tempo sync. So here's another example, now that you've kind of got that in your mind. Try to listen for when it makes this change. Or not. I mean, you can just imagine. Imagine. Oh, there it goes. There it goes. Wow, such a frame rate.
Oh, it's the Xbox rating.
Yeah, this is, yeah. We're not getting audio anymore? Something's a little wonky. Sorry, kids. I don't know what's going on. Well, we'll imagine that it sounded cool. Pretend like these are not the videos. Anyway, so the next game I worked on at LucasArts was Monkey Island 2 Special Edition, a remake of the classic 1992 adventure game. This project had a unique challenge in that the music interactivity was already established by the 1992 original. And it was famous for its very detailed music implementation. It used what was called the iMuse audio system to manipulate MIDI files in real time based on gameplay. It could do things like muting and unmuting MIDI channels, which basically means adding or removing instruments. And it was actually aware of the current playback position, because again, it's MIDI, it's just text essentially. So it could play different transition segments based on what measure you were currently at. And my job as the music supervisor was to reverse engineer it and find a way to create comparable playback with a modern wave file-based audio engine and live recordings. Additionally, we had a feature where at the touch of a button, players could switch back and forth between the classic version and the remastered version. And it would always synchronize. So no matter where you were in the piece, it would always come back exactly where you were in the new version. So I needed a way to seamlessly crossfade between any version at any given time and to recreate all of that original, very complicated implementation. Well, we shipped on PlayStation 3, X360, PC, and iOS, and we actually used Microsoft's Exact audio engine, porting all of it ourselves to iOS and PS3. Exact, unfortunately, has no tempo-based music system. In fact, it has no music system at all. So our solution was a giant CSV file that contained data on how many milliseconds were in each measure, and how many measures were in each piece and where it loops to and so on. The game would then count the milliseconds to guess at what measure was currently playing and cue the transitions accordingly. This allowed us to finish melodies in a seamless and musical way, no matter where in the piece it was currently playing, because the game has a sense of, I'm probably at measure 13 now, let's play the measure 13 transition. So here's hopefully a video that's demonstrating this technique, which we called melodically accurate beat synchronization. If this doesn't work, then okay.
Oh, isn't that cute? Wake up!
What is it?
Remember me? I'm Guybrush.
Do we know you?
I'm Guybrush. You tried to sell me the minutes of a PTA meeting in the last game, claiming it was a map?
Map? I don't know what you're talking about.
No, really.
Why did you wake us up, Gorbush?
See you later.
We can scarcely contain our anticipation.
Hello. Welcome to Woodtick. No treasure hunting zone.
So just a little background on that. The little trombone section where it gets jazzier when the pirates wake up, we just made that up. Like at the session, we noticed he was playing, and he's this amazing jazz player. And we were like, let's do it like your way. Do it your way, and we'll see what we can do with it. And so yeah, that's like one of a couple new features that we added for the re-release. And we also used XX to handle multi-layered cues, taking into account every possibility of what instrument could play together and creating these layered stacks of wave files that the game would mute and unmute in real time. And we used the same crossfading technique to handle the switch between the classic version and the special edition version. Both versions are constantly playing, and when the player switches versions, the game just kind of crossfades between the two. What you have to keep in mind is that, like, in the year 2009, having 9 simultaneous audio streams on iPad was like a huge big deal. It's obviously not now, so that video does not make a lot of sense now. But trust me, it was a technological feat. We're about like halfway point. Were there any questions so far, or can we talk about more Star Wars? Star Wars time. Great. Oh yeah. Oh, hit.
What was like a tough part between like going from the new mix and the original mix?
Do you mean? So the question is, what's the tough part between going from the new and the original? Do you mean in terms of the playback, like implementation, or do you mean more like creating the new arrangements?
I was thinking more playback.
Playback, yeah. So they actually use the same system. We weren't able to, like, that's a good question because we didn't, we had a debate of, do we use iMuse again, just the old programming, and then just build like a MIDI engine or whatever? But at the time they decided, well, on an iPhone, it's probably not a great idea to run 2 audio engines at the same time. So we opted for this solution. If we were to do it nowadays, then we would try to just do it with middleware. We didn't really have it back then, and plus we didn't have like any time or money to make this game, to be perfectly honest. So yeah, we had to kind of make do. But yeah, you know, and then another difficulty was I wanted the classic versions to be very authentic. So I actually bought a hardware MT32 Roland synthesizer, which was very common for like if you wanted like the top of the line audio in 1992. That's what you got. And sorry, are there like multiple microphones on? Let me just. That's way worse. There we go. Yeah, just a big pop sound, you know. I'm just gonna make these as far away from each other. And then I'll just shout deliberately. But yeah, we basically rendered the audio from the MT32 in order to get the classic version. And then for the special editions, of course, that was our new recordings. Any more on Monkey Island? Or? Cool. So the next game I worked on was Star Wars. Wow, you arrived right on time. Next game was Star Wars First Assault, which is a multiplayer-only competitive first-person shooter that was intended for an Xbox Live and PlayStation Network release in 2013. There was no single-player mode for this game, but we wanted to tell a unique story about the stormtroopers and the rebels presented as real people, not romantic, larger-than-life figures like the films portrayed at the time. We also needed a very convincing Star Wars vibe, which meant that music was necessary, but we couldn't compromise the soundscape of such a competitive multiplayer-only game. So here's like an internal sort of trailer that showed a little bit of the gameplay and original music.
Today we strike a blow to the tyranny of the Empire. Control center is under attack. Got one. Let's move, go! Come on, move it! Good spotted! Alliance forces are attacking engineering bay. Take out that sniper! Incoming airstrike!
So our solution for this, for the start, there were no gameplay loops. There's no looping music at all, in fact. Instead, the answer was to develop a mix of very carefully scripted music cues, as well as a gameplay-based skirmish music system that looked at the details of gameplay, how each individual player was approaching the game, and provided each player with a unique musical experience based on their situations. So just starting with the scripted music, this was hard-coded to trigger at certain points during the gameplay. We had the front end, which is like the UI. It's a 15-minute suite of 3 composed pieces that told the story from the soldier's perspective. I call this first-person scoring, which is where I really imagine myself in the situation, and then all the characters are just around me, rather than me telling a distant story like you would normally do in a game score. Next, we had loading screens, which were these brief 20-second-ish cues that were written custom for every single level while the game was loading. We had level intros. There were these sort of drop-ship fly-in sequences that bled right seamlessly into gameplay at the start of the game. So I custom scored those. We had time limits, which were these final 30-second pieces for the attacking or defending team, with a positive spin if it was defending team, meaning you're about to win, and a negative spin if it's the attacking team, meaning you're going to fail your objective. And then that swelled directly into the exfiltration music, which is kind of like Titanfall or Team Fortress, where it's like, all right, the game has ended, but now there's, let's say, 40 seconds to get to a dropship. But if you are the team that won, you can just pick off people, get a few extra points and stuff. And lastly, we have the scoreboards. We had 4 flavors of scoreboards, actually. You either won, or you won in a very close match, or you lost in a very close match. And those all had a different sort of vibe to them. Next was the skirmish music system. This decided when to play in-round music and decided what intensity level of music to play. Again, there were no loops at all. Instead, we used very carefully constructed 45-second pieces with a very specific form. To derive this form, I went to countless dozens of playthroughs and playtests of the game in multiplayer. And I took stock of my own emotional state while I was playing to try to figure out, okay, well, what are the dramatic contours? And when is it intense and when is it more of just alert? And I used that to design the music. So let me play a quick example. Here's an action cue. But I think what you'll notice is that it's not action the entire time. And I'll explain why. What I noticed when playtesting was, if you're in an action situation, like let's say this cue triggered, and I'll explain the triggering in just a sec, but let's say this cue triggered and it's very high intensity, gunfire all around, blasters, etc. You're going to be in that state of heightened, like, oh, what's going on, for 10 seconds max. And then after that, it's more of an awareness, more of like a heightened awareness situation. It's not like action, action, action the whole time. It's, what is that, the brain refractory period or whatever it's called, kind of kicks in, and then it's like, okay, it's not a new stimulus, but you still have that adrenaline rush. So that's why the form is like that. And then it very seamlessly kind of diminuendos into silence. Most of the time, the gameplay was silent without any music, so that we could focus on the sound design for the competitive advantage. For every significant player action, for example, getting a capture point or an assist or a kill or holding the flag for however many seconds and so on, we would add to what we called the action points counter, or the APC. And once the APC reached a certain threshold, it would send an event to the music system, and it was told, okay, play something. But it didn't really know what to play, because we had a second counter that then took into account the local player's situation. For example, if there's enemies around, or if the player is currently engaged in combat, if a player is holding the flag, or if they're within high-intensity volumes that we'd placed around the levels. And it would choose either low-intensity ambient or tension music, or mid-intensity action music, like you just heard here, to play once the APC was triggered. And additionally, we had what we called idle states, which were these randomized 20-second long, very sparse musical bits that would trigger every 30 to 120 seconds. These would play if no other music were playing, scripted or skirmish or so on, or if anything else had played within the past minute. Basically, it was like the lowest priority level, and anything else would just dump this and then play its more important music there. So here's just a very quick video that's going to show the round starting level intro, as well as a couple of the idle states.
Remember, we're fighting to protect peace.
We've located Freedom Base. Get in there and finish them. Be ready. With their backs to the wall, they will fight back hard. Fine work at the docking ring. Rebel supplies of Tabana have been cut. We can expect them to have fewer fighters in the air for the last assault. Long live the Empire!
mostly unscored, and then just little tiny bits of music that we're adding every once in a while. We're not trying to bombard the player with constant musical information to distract from gameplay. And I found that the most effective and what we ended up using the most pieces were the ambient pieces. It turns out that the difference in intensity between an ambient piece and an action piece is nowhere as big as the difference between nothing at all and ambient. So we needed a way to get a ton of content for it, because we knew we'd be playing this all the time. So instead of through composing all of these, I analyzed the ambient cues that I'd already written, and I simulated their form by creating a sequence container within Wise with individual randomized elements. So first I would have some sort of an evolving suspense pedal, and then some overlay moments, and then finally an ending swell. I then had the orchestra record several instances of these individual elements, laid out one by one with a single 3 or 4 minute super cue. And in the end, this simple set of modular pieces could generate about 45-ish minutes of unique music. So here's an example of that. If you can imagine that the game is triggering the same exact thing once again, but now it sounds like this. Powerful tool, and we got a lot of mileage out of it. Now, to coordinate all these different systems, I actually hijacked Wise's master mixer ducking system in order to establish a hierarchy. So when a higher priority queue was requested by the game, the currently playing queue would be faded out and stopped according to some custom ducking rules. And I just organized all of the types of music in priority order with scripted cues at the very top and the skirmish system in the middle and the idles at the very bottom. Unfortunately, although we'd recorded the full score with the London Symphony Orchestra at Abbey Road and nearly finalized the game, Star Wars First Assault was never released due to the Disney buyout of Lucasfilm. So after the resulting layoffs, I set up my Roget Music business and began my freelance composition career, eventually working on my next major title, which was Dead Island 2. Dead Island 2 is a multiplayer-only open-world zombie game set in a vibrant present-day California with 3 different locations around the state. You could play in the San Francisco, in LA, and the Redwoods. And we needed a generalized music system that could handle the mission-based sandbox gameplay. So I created a fairly standard Wise setup for music. We used the middleware Wise again for this one, using their playlists and transitions matrix to drive my California rock-based score. So there were 3 types of music. There were scripted cues for entering garages, which were kind of like your safe zones for the game, and for initially spawning into the game, of course, or going to a different California roadmap, like San Francisco and LA and whatnot. We also had various stingers for the PvP and UI, and we had combat suites, which are sort of like the meat of the game's music, in 4 different intensity levels, which we transitioned between. And finally, we pretty much used the same idle playlist technique from Star Wars First Assault on this one, triggering randomized pieces every 30 to 120 seconds. So here's a quick demonstration of the interactive combat suite system within Wise. levels to the different intensity levels. You can hear different instruments being brought in and out as it goes, different drum patterns as well. So another thing that we use in this game, which I think you're about to hear, is remember when I mentioned the idle playlists? We actually integrated that within the combat suite. So I believe in just a second you're going to hear some elements of that, like this. Very sparse, kind of spooky, almost horror. You'd think a game with zombies would be a horror game, but it wasn't. It was spooky and fun and bizarre. Then finally, we had transitions out of the combat suite if you've killed all the enemies and it's going back into musical silence. And before we go on, I wanted to make a few shout-outs. So Juan was our guitarist for this game. I don't think he played on this track. I think that's just me faking it. But and then we have Doug over there. He was our percussionist. Matt was one of the helped me a lot with implementation on First Assault. So thanks a bunch for that. I apologize if I forgot, but yeah, thank you. So our combat suites were based on an intensity calculation we called the threat level. This was a custom-based interface outside of Unreal Engine where we set the threat levels for every enemy type. For example, we had walkers, we had heavies, and so on. And every type of enemy has 4 possible threat levels based on their current AI state. So they can be roaming, which means that they're basically just inert, or they can be alerted, or they can be searching, like they know you're out there, but they don't know where, or actively engaged in combat. And these compared in different ways based on the archetype. So for example, a roaming walker, which is sort of the cannon fodder enemy, might have a threat level of 1. And an active combat level, it goes up to 4. Whereas a heavy might just simply on alert have a threat level of 6, and so on. So we kind of finagled the numbers so that it made sense in context. These threat levels were added up for every active AI around the player to generate that final value, which we called danger value. And this is the RTPC that we sent to Wise that caused the transitions in intensity between all the 4 different combat layers. So that's kind of the slider that I was playing with in the video just now. We have 5 different combat suites per level, which were randomized every time the player enters and exits the lowest intensity of combat. But we respect a hysteresis threshold so that a different suite doesn't get triggered unless the player hasn't been outside of combat for a certain amount of time. Basically, that means that we don't want to keep playing the same music over and over. We want to have some variety, but we also don't want to just keep spamming with a different cue all the time. So we wanted a little bit of subtlety to the system. We also had hysteresis for the intensity switching level so that the RTPC doesn't just spam Wise with different changes, kind of like I was doing in the video. It wouldn't actually do that in the actual game. Unfortunately, Dead Island 2 suffered the same fate as Star Wars First Assault, with the developer going out of business, canceling the game towards the very end of development. Luckily, I was also working on another title at the same time, Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris, was an expansion of the Tomb Raider franchise, separate from the newly rebooted Tomb Raider series. Hey, sorry.
I want to add about the other game real quick.
Sure.
How did you know, like, what danger levels players were likely to encounter?
How did I know what danger levels players were likely to encounter? So I didn't really need to anticipate that. Basically, we had our values for each of the enemy types. And we tuned them in such a way that, say you're going through, and there's like, let's say 5 or 6 very small cannon fodder enemies. Well, we wanted it to be a low enough number that the music system wouldn't make a big deal about it. But if there were a very heavy enemy, just that enemy's being around meant that, okay, this is kind of intense because you don't know what's going to happen right now. And if they do engage you, then it's like, okay, now we're going to kick into the high gear. We didn't really tune it per level, if that's what you're asking. It was more about just setting up a system and letting it kind of work itself out. Does that answer the question? Or?
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if you had to like test it or like take measurements or averages.
Yeah, there was a lot of testing, like kind of, that's sort of the, when you set up a system like this or the first Assault one, just making the system, if I remember correctly, making the system only took a week, maybe, for the basic, idea. And the rest of the project was just tuning and tuning nonstop. Does that answer your question? Cool. Any more on Dead Island, or? Yes?
Kind of wondering with the ambient generated tracks, if you had to kind of be concerned about all the bits being like the same key or related, or was that not?
That's a good question. Actually, if I remember correctly, I'm going to say the word level, but that refers to like the giant world map of that particular area of California. Each one has a single key that every piece is in. So I think that the Redwoods were all in D, probably, and LA was all in E, and I forget what I did for San Francisco. So that's how we got around that issue. Is there more? No.
Yeah, I have a question. What, like the actual engine that you're using and stuff, like, is there a lot of overhead as far as like the processing power that, like, did you guys like run into like troubles like where like the processing power was getting sucked from something else and kind of like interfere?
So, good question. So the question is, was there processing power overhead? So at this time in game development, this is like PS360 era, most people were worried about RAM usage. And so that's kind of where, because I think PlayStation had like 16 to 20 for audio for most games, which is ridiculous. And then Xbox wasn't really that much better. For music, it wasn't a big deal. However, just using Wise alone, because of the way Wise works, it is a pretty big CPU hog. Like if I remember correctly, you probably know more than I do, but like just sending a play call event in Wise, it takes like an astonishing, like several milliseconds or something, which sounds ridiculous until you realize that it contains so much data just within that play call. It contains all the implementation stuff. So you're not really sending as many as you would in a different engine that's like more economical. But it is something that we did have to consider and make sure not to just spam the engine with all kinds of crap, constantly. The RTPCs, I'm pretty sure, are a different, that's a different command. And I'm not a programmer, so I'm not a million% hip to this. But that is a lot less costly. So you can kind of spam that, and it's fine. Any more, or? Yeah?
Only if you have time. This music that you did for the Star Wars one and then Dead Island 2, like, I mean, that Star Wars music sounds better than like Rogue One, for example. I mean, it sounds,
wow, thank you.
Like John Williams, he was like, yeah, I've got some time, I'll do a video game for you. It's really that good. But then it just, what happens to that? Like all this creative work you put, they're like, sorry.
Remember the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark where it's like top men? So, yeah. Pretty much.
Because you could just, you know what, you should rescore Rouge.
Yeah. Call it Rouge 1.
There you go.
So, on to Lara Croft. We needed a way in this game to support the gameplay, which was much more helter-skelter than is typical for a Tomb Raider game. You would go in and out of combat very, very quickly, and there would be tons of enemies around. Our solution was the Multiplex System. where we bake 3 related cues of different intensities into a single 6-channel wave file. The music defaults to the ambient layer, and then as soon as enemies attack, we have a randomized overlay flourish that plays, and then we crossfade into the action layer. So it's actually literally panning a file. Like, you know, you'd pan from left and right? It's doing that, but like in stereo pairs across a 6-channel wave file in order to generate the music system. And then when combat is over, the multiplex crossfades into the middle layer, which was percussion only, and then very gradually it would go back to the ambient layer. So here's an example of that system in action. It's going to start with the scripted cinematic, and then it'll go into the multiplex cue.
Have shown me the path. I will take back my throne.
Look, Set is raising his army.
He has corrupted the cycles of life and death, and made these spirits into his slaves. The power of Osiris still resides within his staff. If we raise it up, it will affect anything with his glyph.
To be a way up there.
I cannot tell where she is, but Amit is close. Keep your eyes open. We should move. There is no telling when Amit will find you.
So this system was particularly tricky to compose for, because for all of the 3 layers to work seamlessly, the ambient piece and the combat piece had to be in similar keys and tempo with identical harmonic rhythm and hypermeter. You familiar with those terms? It's basically like the speed at which chords change, essentially. I wanted both the ambient and the action layers to each be unique and compelling. So it was a difficult compositional challenge to make both into sensible pieces of music that could stand on their own. So here's a quick montage of one of the overworld suites that we had. It's going to begin with the ambient cue and then lead into combat. Note that these 2 pieces, though they're different, they have identical overall harmonic rhythm. like a crazy slapback on this, or is it just from my, no? Okay, well, good. It sounds awful from here. And not just because I wrote it. No. So music for the tombs also had a unique composition method. We needed the music to be unobtrusive and help players to concentrate on the exploration and solving puzzles. But I also wanted to have authentic world music performances to complement the Egyptian setting. So to score the tomb music, I wrote simple, around 3-minute long evolving pedal tones, and I sent them out to my live performer soloists, playing oud, sipsi, midwiz, kemenche, double bass, and percussion. Doug played on this one as well. Thank you very much. And I gave them all a scale to perform over, usually some form of Arabic minor to go with the Egyptian setting. And they improvised over these. They would get, this simple mental imagery like make this sound swampy, or think of the desert heat, or like the haziness. And they would play that, and I would edit their improvisations into almost like sample libraries of musical phrases. And then I would kind of write music around that. I'd write orchestral music using these sort of phrase libraries, essentially. As a result, we have what I called beautiful wallpaper of ambient music that doesn't distract from the player, has a naturally flowing and authentic improvisation at its core. Just a brief anecdote. I would say the majority of the players that I found for Lara Croft and Temple of Osiris, we found at a MAGFest room jam. Literally, it was like 2 a.m. at MAGFest. So it's where we met too, right? It was like 2013 MAGFest. And we were all just in a room. We brought our instruments. We just started playing. And that's how I met like the vast majority of players on this. And they're now eventually formed the band Disco Cactus, which is playing on Saturday at 2 p.m. main stage.
You're playing too, so.
Yeah, well, I've paid them a lot of money, so now I get to be on stage with them. But yeah, please come check it out. It's going to be great. So, unlike First Assault and Dead Island 2, this game actually came out. And we earned Best Original Soundtrack nominations from the Interactive Academy as well as Game Audio Network Guild. And the success of this project led to some of my more recent scores, Guild Wars, Call of Duty, Mortal Kombat, and Destiny. And these titles were so massive in scope and budget that they all had internal teams dedicated towards the music implementation. So my responsibility has, as of late, been limited to just composing and producing the music. But my almost 20 years of music implementation experience was absolutely invaluable in just understanding exactly how my original music will fit into the gameplay and soundscape. So, yeah, thank you. We have a little bit of time left, but I wanted to, so I will open the floor, of course, to if there's any more questions. Once again, Disco Cactus, 2 p.m. Saturday. In fact, many of the members from Disco Cactus also performed on my Mortal Kombat 11 and Guild Wars 2 and Lara Croft scores. And I'm pretty sure this is our biggest band yet, right? There's like 12, it's a preposterously large band. And I'll have another panel tomorrow at 4 p.m. talking about composing for major franchises. So I'll talk more about my work on Mortal Kombat, Call of Duty, a little bit on Star Wars, Guild Wars, and Destiny. We'll have Cody Matthew Johnson joining us. He's the composer from Resident Evil 2 Remake and Devil May Cry 5, as well as Laura Intravia. She's going to talk about her experiences as a performer on Destiny 2 and Code Vein. So, yeah, any questions? Or? Yeah.
So Again, I'm familiar with Wise. I was wondering if there are any other competing software things that are going on, and like what your knowledge of them is, and what are advantages for the different types of engines, I guess.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So the question is, are there competitors to Wise as far as middleware goes? And the answer is yes. A lot of studios use Fmod. If I were to compare Wise and Fmod, Wise, the whole concept is let's just give sound designers, audio designers, musicians, let's just give them all the tools to themselves create whatever they want. Whereas Fmod is more about let's just solve individual problems. And in lots of cases, Fmod is actually better or more efficient or whatnot. But Wise is a more generalized, the concept is if you get your studio to have Wise, they won't bother your programmers any more than is the absolute minimum. Whereas Fmod, they'll need a little bit more interaction and such.
Yeah, I see Wise is more popular.
Nowadays, I think it is, but they're pretty similar. They're always it's kind of great actually. I mean, it's kind of like Unreal and Unity in that they're both fighting for being the most friendly system that everyone wants to use. They're both very friendly to indies as well. Wise has a great tutoring program too. So yeah, it's good to have that competition. And then there's also other middleware like Fabric for Unity, which I don't know too much about, unfortunately, and Elias, which is not an audio engine. It's actually a music engine that sits on top of Wise or Fmod or whatever, but it's much more powerful with the music elements and features. Yeah.
So, say I wanted to get more experience with using Wise, but I don't have a huge dev team to
yeah.
Try stuff out with. What's a good way to get started with that in terms of maybe developing for some kind of an environment?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So the question was, if you want to get experience in Wise, but you're not on a team, how can you do it? If you actually go to Audio Kinetic's website, Audio Kinetic is the company that makes Wise, they have a whole tutorial setup that you can download the engine for free. You can download sample games, I believe, in Unreal and Unity. And you can play around with implementing. You can all get set up. It's all free. It's all there. The only thing you have to pay for is if you want to get a certification, which might be useful for if you're going for an entry-level position at a studio or something. But otherwise, yeah, they do a great job of tutorializing everything and making sure that you can hit the ground running when you start a project in Wise.
Do you have a cert?
Huh? I do not. No. Which I guess tells you something about. Yeah. Hey.
So when you're hired to write music for a game, are you kind of expected to know right off the bat how sequencing works and how the more programmatic side of actually creating sequences in the game is more is concerned? Or sometimes you just you get onboarded and you're just I just want to write music and that's it. So does it kind of depend on if it's a AAA game or an indie game?
Yeah, so the question is, basically, do you need to know a lot of this implementation stuff if you're getting hired as just the composer? The answer is the same as if I were to ask you, do you need to know how to read music in order to write music? And the answer is no, you kind of don't. You can download whatever and write music at all times, but it's knowledge that I think is very useful. There are some projects where they do need the composer to, if not implement themselves, then they will need to know how to write for a system like that, which is something that's very difficult to teach someone who's only done linear music, for films or whatever. So it's very great knowledge to have, and it also makes you very attractive to potential clients, but it's not 100% necessary. I do know that there are some composers who just want to write music. They don't want to concern themselves with this stuff. I find this absolutely fascinating, as you can tell by my blabbing on for an hour about this. So it just kind of depends. But I think it's great knowledge to have. Yeah. Hey, yeah.
So given that you've been doing this for such a long time, but that nowadays you find that teams are doing implementation and you're doing more composition, do you find them looking to you for guidance on their implementation, how they can design systems that best fit your work?
So the question is, now that I have the experience in implementation, do teams that are going to do the implementation themselves look to me for guidance on how to implement? It depends quite a lot. I've worked, I can't say that. Well, okay, I can. Okay, so, well, no, now that I said that, now I can't say that.
Fish those NDAs.
Yeah, wrap it up. We'll talk after. The short answer is sometimes they have established systems and teams and whatnot, and it's not. They're not super interested in my input. Other times, yes. And it doesn't really matter the size of the team. It's just company to company. I've been asked to wrap it up, so once again, thank you very much for coming, and enjoy MAGFest.